Welcome to Heart Yoga Radio. This is another podcast in our Interesting Time series, and this one deals with the rapidly developing Cold War on China. In this podcast, I hope to give you a reasonably accurate picture of what's going on at the moment as this Cold War unfolds, but also to give you some of the background behind this phenomenon. But why are we talking about Cold War at all? Recently in the UK, a number of ministers, members of the Tory party, have been sanctioned by the Chinese government. This actually means that they won't be able to travel in China. If they have any assets in China, that they'll be impounded by the Chinese government. This includes Ian Duncan Smith, who I think wears this as a badge of honour. The Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has tweeted about this and made sort of grumpy noises about the Chinese government. And this is in retaliation to economic sanctions being placed on China by the EU, by the UK, but primarily by the US. Something that Donald Trump enthusiastically promoted. And President Biden seems quite keen on continuing. It's probably worth mentioning in this context that a couple of weeks ago, the chief BBC correspondent in Beijing fled to Taiwan. I'm not sure whether he was thrown out, but certainly he was feeling that the plainclothes police watching his apartment was probably the last straw. At the same time, the Today programme on Radio 4 has been signalling that this is a matter for its propaganda activity. There's pretty well an item every day on the Radio 4 about China, and often doing that repetitive thing that they do, which signals to listeners that they are on the propaganda warpath, going on about genocide in Xinjiang. And this is very reminiscent of the daily repetition of Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitism. It's the same pattern. You can hear the directive dropping on the mat, as it were, from Tory Party HQ, and then Nick Robinson gets on the case. And it's there as a kind of a noise, as a clamour and as a clatter in the foreground, certainly here in the UK. Obviously, when something of this character starts unfolding in the UK, you need to look over the Atlantic, because as sure as night follows day, the UK government's going to get its snout right up the arse of the US government and play Me Too in good poodle fashion. Somewhat prior to this tit-for-tat sanctions game, there was the matter of Huawei, a Chinese tech company, a mobile phone manufacturer, and a world leader in 5G infrastructure technology, who was banned from doing its stuff in the US, having already been instrumental in the unfolding implementation of 5G in the US. And I believe that Huawei executive has been sort of detained, I think, in Canada on behalf of the US, under the pretext that the Huawei, as a China-based company, will be actually spying on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China through the infrastructure. At first, the UK didn't follow suit, and again, they are sort of fairly well along the way with the Huawei technology. Finally, but the UK government finally capitulated to the US and has also outlawed Huawei. Recently, there was a summit in Alaska between upper echelons of the Chinese government and the US. Very acrimonious. A lot of basically trading insults. Who's got the worst human rights record? And it's obvious from that China's not going to take this shit lying down. This is in the context of a huge build-up of American forces and Chinese forces in the South China Sea. South China Sea is crucial to China. It's a primary trade route for China. Johnson in the UK responds by sending a UK aircraft carrier. I think the UK might have one or two aircraft carriers. The last I heard that these aircraft carriers, though they're state of the art, there are no aeroplanes for them. And it's, again, this is just gesture politics in the part of the UK. It's just the UK government getting its snout up the US's arse. All this in the context, which I've just hinted at, of the kind of lurid propaganda and denials and to-in and fro-in about what actually is going down in Xinjiang vis-a-vis the minority population there, the Uyghurs. Actually, the Uyghurs compose 60% of this huge district in the west of China, called Xinjiang. It has sometimes been called East Turkestan. So, of course, there's an issue around Taiwan, which again is being aggravated. Now, Taiwan is an island off the coast of China, about 90 miles off the coast, which China has always said is a part of the Chinese state. Historically, it's belonged with China through the various dynasties. But at the end of the Revolution Civil War, the Kuomintang, the American-backed Kuomintang, the pro-capitalist faction, retreated to Taiwan and fortified it. And so to this day, it has this kind of separate existence. China still claims it vehemently. At some point, a couple of decades ago, the US recognised China's claim on Taiwan, but is perhaps to some extent reneging on that now. Historically, the US has always supported Taiwan and helped it to defend itself. Recently, Chinese warplanes have been buzzing the airspace around the edges of Taiwan airspace, which is increasing the temperature. I mean, we do have to be aware that there are hawks in the Chinese government. Also, there's shenanigans afoot in Hong Kong with demonstrations, riots, and I heard today the imprisonment of a Hong Kong billionaire who's protested against the Beijing's tightening grip on Hong Kong, particularly on its reserving to itself the right to determine who can stand for elections into the Hong Kong Parliament. Now, Hong Kong, it should be remembered, was a British colony for 100 years. And it was a colony. It wasn't a sort of a bastion of democracy. It was certainly a bastion of capitalism. But under treaty agreements, Hong Kong was returned to China, which again has never relinquished its claim on Hong Kong. And there are shenanigans there as well, with all the attendant propaganda coming from all sides. So, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, China is in the news. And with very good reason. The fundamental background against which this Cold War is developing, I would say, is the ongoing decline of the American empire. In case you think this is a rather bold and impressionistic assertion, I'd refer you to the work of Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is a very fine commentator, historian, and highly experienced foreign correspondent with lots of first-hand experience of the way in which states can suddenly crumble into chaos. I think Chris was actually present on the ground in Yugoslavia when all that went to shit. Having said that, the US is still effectively the global hegemon. at this moment. Here's a little bit of background then to the nature of United States hegemony. US hegemony was really consolidated near the end of World War II in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, which was held, strangely enough, at a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. US power had been growing prior to that momentous conference, as the British Empire was going into decline. I mean, basically, even in the 30s, the British were operating their empire by borrowing money from the Americans, and the Americans were making interest on the activity of the British Empire prior to World War II. And then during World War II, the US pretty well bankrolled in one way or another the British war effort with Lend-Lease and so forth. But in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, it looked as though it was pretty certain that the Allies were going to win the war, and it was only a matter of time, and that some decisions need to be made about the condition of the world economy and the management of the world economy, you might say, after the end of the war. It was decided at that conference that a World Bank would be instituted and that there would be some sort of regulation of world trade. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, was one of the chief thinkers, economic thinkers present at the conference, and he suggested that all world trade should be conducted in a reserve currency, which he proposed would be called the Bancor. The Americans resisted the idea of the Bancor and insisted that the dollar, the US dollar, the God Almighty dollar, would be the world reserve currency, and that the dollar would be backed by gold. This actually held until 1971, when Nixon withdrew the American economy from the gold standard. The dollar nevertheless remained the global reserve currency, and it still pretty well is. After that, you could say that the dollar was backed by US military might. When you consider that two countries, which the US, in its wisdom, decided to bomb back into the Stone Age, happened to be countries with large reserves of oil, that attempted to sell their oil in another currency other than the dollar. And in fact, I think it was the euro that they thought they would sell their oil. You'll surely be able to see the point of how military power can back a currency. I mean, the countries in question, Libya and Iraq, both devastated, both completely ruined, because they tried to sell their oil in euros instead of in dollars. Obviously, other reasons were given for those wars, like weapons of mass destruction, for instance, in the case of Iraq, which, with hindsight, we know to have been just a pure bunch of propagandist lies, just out-and-out lies. Now, why am I saying in this situation that US hegemony is declining, that the US empire is going through a process of collapse? Given that the US spends more money on its military, the true source of its power, than I think actually the rest of the countries in the world put together. A huge military budget and increasing, immense military power, particularly when you consider how many nuclear weapons the US is in possession of, and the fact that the US has around 800 bases worldwide. Well, we have to look no further than the rise of China. China has experienced the most extraordinary economic growth since about 1979. Deng Xiaoping, who is the most influential member of the Communist Party of China, from 1979 until his death in 1997, instituted massive economic reforms in China, including the setting up of economic zones to start with, which allowed foreign enterprises to invest, which allowed free enterprise and a market system. You might say a gladiatorial system of capitalism was instituted in China. There was a kind of a deal, you might say, or a contract with the Chinese people, which said, we will let you get rich as long as you don't give us any shit about democracy and human rights and all that Western liberal stuff. There was still, however, a very large state sector. You could say that Deng had seen the trajectory that Marx outlined, that socialism could only evolve out of a highly developed capitalism and not straight out of a peasant economy, which China was prior to the revolution. Whatever the case with regard to that somewhat speculative thesis, China did grow at roughly 10% a year since 1979. And in real terms, that means that people's standard of living was doubling every 7 years. And this has been going on since 1979. Interestingly, China did take a small hit due to the pandemic in recent times, the COVID-19 pandemic. But the first quarter of this year, 2021, the Chinese economy grew by 18%. Now, to put this in context, the Western economy would be very pleased with 4%. That would be deemed a boom. And 2% is kind of okay. Not doing too bad if we get 2% a year. China has had 10% a year for how long? 40 years. Slavoj Žižek makes a very interesting observation about this state of affairs. And it is that capitalism can function very well indeed under an authoritarian government, under a one-party system. And now there is a presumed natural relationship between capitalism and democracy by liberal commentators and theorists. And it really doesn't hold water in the case of China. The historical, objectively observable case of China makes the point for us. And you can see, actually, in the move towards authoritarianism, both in the US and in other parts of the West, and in Britain at the moment, very, very obvious moves towards authoritarianism by the Tory government. Might actually be understood as a kind of an envy of the scope that the Chinese Communist Party has for determining its economy and for making space in the economy for some pretty rampant gladiatorial capitalism. Now, obviously, the US and the Western powers that tag along with it is challenged by this meteoric rise of China in terms of its economic strength and its rate of development. Here is a competitor to its global hegemony. And quite naturally, a propaganda war is going to arise out of this state of affairs, notwithstanding the fact that there is immense US investment in China and immense Chinese investment in other countries, and particularly in Western powers. I mean, Australia is a good example. Australia is a country with huge reserves of lithium, and those lithium mines are actually owned by Chinese companies. And of course, lithium is now a strategic mineral now that the world is trying to move towards green energy and electric cars, which requires huge amounts of lithium for the battery storage of electrical power. The obvious response of the West, and of the US in particular, is to accuse China of being an authoritarian one-party state, which actually it is. And to remark on the lack of democracy and press that home as a weapon, you might say, an ideological weapon, and to go on about a concomitant lack of civil rights and so forth. At this point, I want to consider arguments put forward by Martin Jacques. Martin Jacques is a commentator I recommend to you. Martin Jacques is an old British communist. He was around when I was a lad, doing Marxist stuff on the fringes of UK political life. Martin Jacques has actually since kind of reconfigured himself as a China expert. And he does know his stuff, does Professor Jacques. He has 2 academic positions in China, one in Beijing, one in, I think, in Shanghai. He's very, very well acquainted with China. Martin Jacques tells the story of how he became a China expert, and it was quite kind of by accident. And he did have to learn Chinese and so forth. But he really is the dog's bollocks, I think, on things China. And he's a very thorough and very intelligent commentator. And one of Martin Jacques' things is to say that it's actually wrong for us to attempt to interpret China in our kind of Western liberal post-Enlightenment framework or paradigm or whatever you want to call it. And he thinks that we should try and inhabit the Chinese cultural framework to try and understand what's going on there. In his own attempt to do that very thing, he appeals to Chinese history, the long spread of Chinese history. China is the longest continuous civilization on the planet by a long way. I mean, some people might think that India is a competitor there, but certainly both of these old cultures do stretch back millennia. Certainly in the case of China, 2,500 years is yesterday, really. And Martin Jacques makes the point that China is still, for all intents and purposes, Confucian, and that democracy doesn't figure in that mindset. I would perhaps take a little bit of issue with that. After all, Marxist-Leninism, out of which Maoism developed, is a very Western way of looking at things. It's dependent on the Enlightenment in as much as Hegel was dependent on Kant and Marx himself was dependent on Hegel, even though reworking it for his own purposes. We must remember that Mao, in this context, had quite an antipathy to Confucianism. Confucianism is very conservative. It celebrates the family. It thinks that society will be harmonious if people obey the rules, and the rules should be very strictly obeyed. And there are rules that are based around filial piety. You know, that actually like honour within families, honour by children for their parents, and so forth, and a sense of hierarchy, and a very deep conservatism. And Mao was naturally antipathetic to Confucianism, and you could argue that one of the purposes of the Cultural Revolution which Mao precipitated was to excise Confucianism from Chinese society. Now, there might be a question around the extent to which that was successful. But nevertheless, Martin Jakes has spent a lot of time in China, has travelled around, has 2 academic positions within Chinese universities. He's of the opinion that Confucianism still has got quite a lot of momentum behind it in China. And if we want to understand China, we need to understand that long, continuous culture back 2.5 millennia, 3 millennia, more even. And not to attempt to impose a Western frame, you might call it, or a Western paradigm, an Enlightenment paradigm of democracy, egalitarianism, libertarianism, and so forth upon it. I think that's an open question, but certainly Martin Jakes is somebody I recommend that you listen to and study. He's written some massive books on this matter, and I do have a lot of respect for him, and I do have a lot of trust for his take on this matter. There is lots of material on the internet, on YouTube in particular, featuring Martin Jakes, and there was a recent interview between Martin Jakes and Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, which is very well worth a watch, and you'll find this easily if you just do a search, and if you are interested in this matter. So, at this point I want to say it's not too problematic to say that as far as the US is concerned, there is a challenge to its global hegemony simply because of the rate at which the Chinese economy has been growing for the last 40 years. And the fact that it has now reached a point where China might well overtake the US in terms of GDP and the size of its economy. Now, moving on, I want to consider China's relationship with other states, with the rest of the world. The first thing that needs mentioning is that China's huge rise has been dependent upon US corporations outsourcing their production to China, because China was offering, in the first instance when all this started to unfold, cheap labour. And labour which is much cheaper than American labour. The way this actually happened is that companies like Apple, for instance, would get all their iPhones and Apple Macs manufactured in China, but under licence. They wouldn't actually open any plant in China. They would give Chinese corporations licences to manufacture the iPhones. And this was very instrumental in the rise of China, in the development and the rapid growth of the Chinese economy. But there was a remarkable concomitant to this arrangement. American corporations, because they were outsourcing their labour to China, were not creating jobs in the US itself. Actually, this was one of the reasons why Trump became popular, because he sought to reverse this process. He didn't succeed in reversing it, but he promised that he would reverse it so that defunct steel plants in the Rust Belt and so forth would be able to revive their industries and re-employ workers. Of course, there's a little bit of this happened, but not as much as he promised. I mean, the guy was good at making promises and not so great at keeping them. But the actual psychological insight that people understood that their jobs were being outsourced or offshored to China was quite kind of sound. So there's a sense in which the rise of China has been purely balanced in the most direct way by the decline of America and the decline of American cities. I should note here that Chris Hedges makes the point having studied many empires in decline, that the first thing that goes when an empire is on its way down are the cities. The cities become impoverished. They become wastelands. They become dystopian places, and places in which it's not very nice to live, in which there is mass unemployment, in which people do the things that they have to do to survive in conditions which are quite ugly. At the same time as China has taken on this role of workshop of the world, which incidentally was a role that the English Midlands took on for the late 19th century, good part of the 20th century, it has meant that the US has become a market for China, and Western Europe, of course, and the so-called developed West has become a market for the Chinese goods. And you look upon pretty well any product that you buy and it'll say on it made in China. Ironically, the famous MAGA hats, Make America Great Again, the red baseball caps that the Trump fanatics like to wear, are for the most part made in China. So two things there. America has become China's market. America has become the go-to place to get cheap labour. And remember, corporations will always seek cheap labour. Pure Marxism here. The Marxist analysis tells us exactly why this is the case. Because labour is the place where you can save on your costs, on your production costs. There are global agreements vis-à-vis raw materials. Raw materials go at pretty well the same price everywhere on the planet. So your only variable in your production costs is labour costs. So if you can get cheap labour costs, as long as there is a market, you can produce goods and make the most profit, as long as you can sell the damn things. Now, given that Trump tried to sort of reverse this state of affairs, actually by placing sanctions on China or by putting tariffs on Chinese goods, in the attempt to get American corporations to restart production in America, China was bound to respond. The nature of that response is quite understandable. Remember that China has been growing at 10% a year for 40 years. Thereabouts. Trump gets in, tries to go for American isolationism and repatriating offshore jobs in the face of the logic of global capitalism. This means that China has by now got itself quite a wealthy middle class and a wealthy working class that itself is wanting to become the owners of nice iPhones and nice cars and nice apartments. In other words, the growth of the Chinese economy has created a large population of people with spending power. In other words, it's created its own internal market. So the Chinese planners in the oligarchical Communist Party are able to use their planning power to pivot the Chinese economy into one in which it's got its own internal markets and becomes less dependent on exporting its goods around the world. Notice I say less dependent, I don't say independent. China is still wanting to open markets up for its products all around the world. And I'll kind of turn to this in a moment and explain to you how this is the case. But having an internal market is a wonderful buffer against the kind of Trumpian isolationism. And no doubt this is a good place to make the point that China and the Chinese Communist Party and the strategy that it took on in the late 70s under Deng Xiaoping has managed to raise 800 million people out of poverty. This is a remarkable economic achievement that's never been equalled in world history as far as we know. This reinforces the point that Slavoj Žižek makes, that an authoritarian one-party state is probably better able to manage capitalism than a multi-party democracy, for instance. And this is no doubt the reason why certainly the US and the UK have what are in effect one-party states, even though they have two pseudo-parties, which are really, as we say, two cheeks of the same arse, because they want to enjoy the dynamics of an unfettered capitalism and the degree of development that China has demonstrated is possible. Now, I mentioned that even though China is developing its own internal markets, it still remains committed to a kind of outreach, to an openness. And again, this is a Dengist policy. The One Belt, One Road initiative is the perfect example of this Chinese initiative. The One Belt, One Road is a project, a huge project of developing infrastructure all the way across Eurasia. The One Road is sometimes called the New Silk Road, and it is an attempt to build and facilitate road and rail networks between the manufacturing high-tech centres of China, Shenzhen, right the way across Asia and Europe, right the way to Rotterdam, and then obviously onwards into the British Isles, so that Chinese goods can be exported and that European goods can be imported into China. And there's also a suggestion of a north-south axis in which China will develop railways into Pakistan. Pakistan, I think, is going to turn into a cheap labour pool for China as its middle class and as its working class demands higher pay, and there'll be an imperative for Chinese capitalism to seek cheaper labour, and I think it may well move into Pakistan to do this. But certainly there are plans to have railroad connection through Pakistan right the way down into the warm water ports on the Arabian Sea. The one belt is to do with sea transport, which is why the South China Sea is so important, where there is an immense build-up of American naval power. But in order to take produce to Africa, and again, a warm water port in the Arabian Sea in Pakistan would be extremely advantageous to Chinese commerce for joining up with Africa. And China is immensely busy in Africa, and in a rather different way from the old imperialists. It does try and create win-win situations in these trade agreements, and I think I'm not wanting to say that the Chinese Communist Party is in any way perfect, that China is a workers' paradise, that it's an absolute paradigm of wonderful reasonableness. It certainly isn't. Governments do bad things, even if they're not particularly authoritarian. I don't have any rose-tinted spectacles to wear on this matter, but nevertheless, China is being very sensible, clever in its relationship with Africa, for instance. The same goes for South America. So the One Belt, One Road initiative is huge. And China is well equipped, actually, to put this project into operation. Now, I'll just expand on this a little bit. In 2008, when the world economy collapsed, China went straight into an interventionist mode as a government and did a kind of a New Deal scenario of putting people to work. China couldn't afford to have millions and millions of workers out of work. Remember, this is a country with a population of 1.2, 1.3 billion. It couldn't afford to have workers out of work. And Chinese workers, contrary to opinion, are quite willing to go on strike and may even go as far as rioting when they're disgruntled. Now, in 2008, the collapse of the world economy led to collapsing demand for consumer goods, of which China was a leading producer. Amongst the New Deal type projects that the Chinese government initiated, one was the building of an enormous network of high-speed railway. I think it's something like 30 or 35,000 kilometres of high-speed railway. So they've already got the expertise and the experience in these massive infrastructure projects. So Belt and Road could proceed apace, unless, of course, China faces very concerted geopolitical opposition. Martin Jakes' view is that this outreach doesn't have the imperialist character of the behaviour of either the British Empire or the American Empire. And he does draw on the history, the long history of Chinese civilization, which has never, in its long history, ever been colonial. It's never gone to another part of the world and settled land and taken over land and governed land. It's always remained within its kind of fairly steady borders. I mean, they do expand and contract a bit. And in despite of having huge naval forces at various times in its history, China has never done that. This seems to be the case, actually, with this current reaching out of China into Africa, into Europe, into Latin America. And it does seem to be based on, yes, a desire for markets, yes, a desire for a necessity to come by raw materials for its industry, and yes, a desire for for influence. It's not totally altruistic, but there does seem to be an outlook which, in deals and in trade, you try and craft win-win solutions. And I don't think this is too optimistic or too Pollyanna-ish about China. And certainly China is very well aware of the fact that it is in competition with the global hegemon, and that it is rapidly rising to the position of being the world's strongest economy. And it's not shying away from what that involves. And this means, particularly, that there is a gradual attempt on China's part to grow some alternative to the hegemony of the dollar, of the sole use of the US dollar as the currency of reserve across the world. China has been mining and buying gold for some time and building up gold reserves. It recently, last week or the week before, did a deal with Iran to buy $400 billion worth of Iranian oil over the next 10 years. Now, this is a godsend for Iran, which is under severe sanctions from the US. They are sort of decades-long enemies, the US and Iran. Iran is an enemy of Israel, and Israel is an enemy of Iran, and Israel is backed by the US, and the US gives Israel gives Israel $8 billion a year of aid, most of which is spent on military. So there's a very explosive situation there in the Middle East. And Iran, as I say, under severe sanctions from the US. But China has said, no, we'll do it. We'll do a deal with you. And obviously they need the oil. And Iran needs the money. So this is, a win-win on both sides there. And Trump, in his wisdom, withdrew from the nuclear non-proliferation deal that the US and the EU and so forth had with Iran, which is an attempt to control Iran's enrichment of uranium, a process which can lead to the production of weapons-grade uranium, uranium-235, and the spectre of a nuclear Iran. China, though, in making this $400 billion deal for oil from Iran, has claimed that part of its reasoning is that Iran has done very well in sticking to the international agreement vis-à-vis enriching uranium. Now, Biden wanted to re-enter some kind of a deal with Iran over the uranium enrichment and to partly undo what Trump had done in that he withdrew entirely from it. But Biden has thought he's seen a chance now to renegotiate the deal and make it a little bit stronger and more in favour of the US and perhaps more agreeable to Israel. But China has said, oh no, they've done fine, we're going to reward them with an oil contract. So, in a sense, they've trumped Biden, if I can put it like that. There's a lot of ins and outs to this, and if you're interested, you'd need to look it up. Now, in the same vein, China and Russia have been in talks at very high levels, and they come into agreements vis-à-vis not using the dollar for trade. And Russia's got lots of raw materials that China would like, and they're striking up very friendly relationships. And both, of course, are under sanctions from the US. Russia is heavily sanctioned by the US and heavily propagandised against by US media and US politicians. So it's natural for them to team up. And I think it's only today or yesterday that to complete the picture, Iran has been having very friendly talks with Russia. So we've got Russia, Iran and China in a nice, cosy arrangement, and with agreements, at least nascent agreements, that they won't be using the US dollar as the reserve currency. So you see there's the hegemony that the US propagates through its currency is there being kind of sort of quite severely chipped away. And there's more in this vein. I recently found out that Michael Hudson, who I would say is one of the most able living economists, is helping the Chinese government and the Russian government to find a way of trading without using the dollar, but without allowing either of their currencies to become economically hegemonic. And it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to devise a system in which the currencies share the load, as it were. And he's actually, he's working for the Chinese government on this very project. Again, he calls it the de-dollarisation of the world, which he thinks is desirable. As if that wasn't enough, earlier on this year, China and 14 other nations in the Southeast Asia region signed a free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is now one of the world's biggest free trade areas with 15 nations and 30% of the world's population within its bounds. It includes countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, which all have some kind of military alliance with the US at the same time as they're now belonging to this free trade area, which I think creates interesting contradictions and tensions for those countries. And when you're investigating this kind of thing, always look for the tensions, always look for the contradictions. And if that wasn't enough, I think I'm probably going to mention, in this economic context, in this China influence context, vaccine diplomacy. China is engaged in vaccine diplomacy, unlike the so-called developed West, which is engaging in vaccine nationalism, with countries holding back vaccines for themselves and not spreading it around, as it were, and perhaps being a little bit mean with patents and so forth. China is sending doctors to many parts of the global south, as well as exporting its vaccine. Particularly in South America, China is offering vaccines, either free or cheap. Even to Brazil, despite the fact that Bolsonaro is a sworn enemy of China and is prone to making racist remarks about Chinese people. Nevertheless, China, in its wisdom, and I think it is wisdom, has offered Brazil anti-COVID vaccines. And bear in mind that Brazil is absolutely in the throes of a very severe pandemic, with its hospitals stretched to the limit, and with an emergent strain that's actually making young people under 40 and in good health, quite ill, and killing quite a few of them. So there's this Brazilian strain is rather more lethal and infectious than the first strain that made its way around the world. Now, if you conclude that China is doing quite well in its competition for hegemony with the US, you'd be right. When it comes to the matter of technology, you find that this view is further compounded. Chinese technology is coming forward in leaps and bounds. They are very advanced in AI and quantum computing and blockchain and general IT type tech. I mean, the chap to follow up on this, a good expert on Chinese technological development, is a guy called Winston Ma, who I think was educated in China at university level in technology, but I think he's now a commentator in the US. Look him up, Winston Ma. He's very good on technology in China. Now, it looks as though China has leapt ahead of the West in quantum computing with an optical quantum computer, which can operate at room temperature. The quantum computers produced by D-Wave and IBM, etc., need very, very low temperatures to operate, and so they're sort of quite tricky to operate. They have to be down near absolute zero. But if you use photons, in other words, like lasers, basically, you can do quantum computing at room temperature. Now, China's made a bit of a song and dance about developments that it's made in that area. I mean, if you had a suspicious mind, you'd think this was a bit of propaganda that they're putting out, not necessarily true, just to put the wind up the Americans. Because if this thing gets developed, you know, the American banks and finance and Wall Street and the American military are going to have to sort of get their skates on with their quantum security, their quantum cryptography. Now, such a thing does exist. There are whole university departments dealing with quantum cryptography. It's not as though quantum computing will be able to hack everything, but it does create a challenge. An interesting thing vis-a-vis the money question, the question of de-dollarizing the world, China is working very hard on a government blockchain, Bitcoin-like, but not Bitcoin, because it'll be a government blockchain, to place the RMB, the Chinese trading currency, on the blockchain to facilitate secure and fraud-resistant trading. And Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, has publicly stated that the Chinese economy will be developing blockchain and blockchain types of technology to the highest degree that it can. It's all very interesting stuff. I'm going to turn now very briefly to the matter of the build-up of military forces facing off against each other, US and allies versus China, and the potentiality for actual military conflict. In this context, I have to note that China does have a pretty extensive military capability. It doesn't have bases around the world like the US does. As I mentioned before, the US has 800 bases. 400 of those bases are very near to China and, in a sense, are surveilling or attempting to police China. China has 2 foreign bases, I believe. I think one's in Africa. I'm not sure where the other one is. I think there might be one in Latin America somewhere. 2 small bases. Both powers have nukes. China has 300, somewhere between 300 and 350 nukes. America's got roughly 10 times that amount. There is a lot of wargaming in the US and exercises, and I think China is probably being very thorough in its defence militarily, I would say, and I think we can kind of assert with some certainty that that is the case. Larry Wilkerson, who's a very interesting commentator, a sworn Republican, Larry Wilkerson's colonel in the US Army, or colonel retired, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff. Colin Powell was George Bush Jr.'s war guy, defence guy. I mean, he's remarked that Xinjiang, which we're going to turn to in a moment, is the key to regime change. So the US obviously has discussed the notion that it could affect some regime change in China. I think by now they will be realising that that's a pretty tall order. An interesting commentator who I've listened to recently is a guy called Lloyd Goldstein. Lloyd Goldstein is a professor at the Naval War College in the US, which is an official part of the military where officers are educated. And he's a military strategist and a teacher of military strategy. He actually heads up a department in the Naval War College dedicated to matters China. So he's an interesting guy to listen to. He doesn't mind speaking out in a personal capacity. And I've seen him talking to Aaron Maté, who is one of the Grey Zone team. And Grey Zone will be hearing about in a moment. But they are very focused on debunking and exposing and untangling US government propaganda, and which it uses as one of its means of assuring its global hegemony. In this context of Lloyd Goldstein talking to Aaron Maté, Goldstein reckons that Taiwan is a potential trigger point, but he thinks that if China decided to invade Taiwan and take it back into its direct control, and that the Americans attempted to defend, that they would last 2 weeks. The Americans would only last 2 weeks. And I think he's a bloke who ought to know, can I put it like that? And he's very concerned about the tension and the build-up, but it couldn't end well for anybody, really, should a hot war break out. But we're saying that, and there are, a great amount of military force active in the South China Sea. China has modernised its military very extensively in recent years, and to the dismay of analysts in the US, military analysts, it's done this whilst only spending 1.5% of GDP on military, in contrast to the US spending about 4% of GDP on military and a bigger GDP. Of course, the China doesn't have to maintain 800 bases around the world and doesn't have any ongoing wars at the moment, unlike the US, which is still just about hanging in there in Afghanistan. Still got troops on the ground in Iraq and so forth. A good guy on this is Vijay Prasad. If you ever get a chance to look anybody up who's very, very good on international relations. So Vijay Prasad is a Marxist historian and columnist. He's written dozens of books, very, very high quality, tremendous Indian Marxist intellectual. And he gives a good analysis of the military build-up if you wanted to go a bit further with that. Vijay Prasad. Could all this turn into a shooting war? Well, one certainly hopes not. And I think not. I think sense will prevail. But you can't guarantee it. It is a tinderbox. And wars have a nasty habit of breaking out accidentally. But it would be a real disaster for everybody concerned. There's no doubt about that. And there are a few contraindications, which I'll mention in my conclusion. Okay, I'm going to turn now to my last chunk, which interests me on this matter of Cold War on China, and that is to the matter of propaganda. Now, you're probably hearing it almost every day now that there are concentration camps in Xinjiang, which is a far western province of China. You'll hear people saying 1 million people in concentration camps, 2 million people in concentration camps, and now we're hearing 3 million people in concentration camps in Xinjiang. It's going the rounds on the mainstream media. Mike Pompeo, for instance, who was Trump's Secretary of State, was stating it like it was fact. BBC state it every day like it's fact. Even some of the alternative media, like Democracy Now!, have been stating it like it's fact. And the trope is there is genocide in Xinjiang. Now, if you investigate this, and I've spent a lot of time investigating this, it's almost certainly untrue. Genocide certainly is far too strong a word. This is the opinion of Lloyd Goldstein, who I just mentioned, a professor of military strategy working for the US military. So somebody deeply embedded in the system. It's the opinion of the World Bank. It's the opinion of the International Criminal Court. Two organisations, again, deeply embedded in the system. It's the opinion of Martin Jakes, who I've mentioned. And the Grey Zone, an alternative news channel with its own websites and so forth and YouTube, has done a great deal of work unpicking these rumours. And the truth of the matter is that there is very little evidence, and that genocide certainly is too strong a term, and concentration camp is too strong a term. The people who are really pushing this and who are being taken notice of by the mainstream media and by the governments tend to be Xinjiang separatists or East Turkestan separatists. And there is a movement that, for as far as I can see, does receive CIA backing and does receive American think tank backing and even American military backing in certain wings of that movement, which is dedicated to separatism, separating Xinjiang from the rest of China and forming in the region an Islamic state. Now, there's no way the Chinese government's going to go along with that any more than the British or the American government would go along with something similar. But there's no evidence. Given that there's no evidence, And given the seriousness of the accusation, genocide for God's sake, people are even using the term Holocaust and concentration camp. How has this piece of propaganda managed to gain such traction? And it does seem as though it's officially backed, from the highest levels of the United States state, from the highest levels of its military-industrial complex. And the fact that the evidence is very poor has been uncovered by the Grey Zone, by Max Blumenthal, who is somebody I respect and who's written some great books about the Middle East, and is very clued up about Venezuela, Latin America, and China. Ajit Singh, who is a colleague of Max Blumenthal's. Also, Professor Ken Hammond, who's done quite a lot of detective work tracing the origins of the rumour, or of the slander, you might call it. And both Max Blumenthal and Professor Ken Hammond have tracked the origins of this propaganda down to two sources, basically. One is a very far-right think tank based in Australia called the Australian Strategic Defence Institute, which is funded by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, two of the world's biggest arms manufacturers. In fact, Lockheed Martin, I believe, is the world's biggest arms manufacturer, and Raytheon manufactures the famous Tomahawk cruise missiles. So they're funding this Australian Strategic Defence Institute, as is the US State Department, which is the US Foreign Ministry, as it were. The other source is a character called Adrian Zenz, who is a German seminarian, he's some kind of theology professor or something of that order. And Adrian Zenz gets debunked, given that he holds some apocalyptic end times rapture style beliefs. Adrian Zenz thinks that there's a correct way for punishing children by hitting them, which is good for them, which he calls scriptural spanking. So you can get some kind of measure of his character from that. He thinks that equality between the sexes is satanic. In fact, that any kind of equality talk or any attempts to bring about social justice is satanic. Now, this is not to say that Adrian Zenz might not occasionally come up with some truthful information. And there probably is a grain of truth in some of his accusations. But he's a guy that's busy, very busy, in fact, propagating the Holocaust of Uyghurs in Xinjiang propaganda story. Somebody like Badem Panada, who likes to debunk everybody, does point out, in fact, that Adrian Zenz isn't always wrong. And nobody thinks it's hunky-dory in Xinjiang, given that there is a separatist movement. And given that this separatist movement has, on occasions, set off bombs, including in Beijing, and that adherents to this cause run amok with knives and doing mass stabbings and that kind of thing. So there is a certain tension in Xinjiang over this matter. Now, the Uyghurs are Muslims, and of course Chinese communism is officially atheistic. The Chinese constitution should allow freedom of religion, and there are many, many mosques in Xinjiang. And of course you can see propaganda movies which are kind of rather naff, put out by the Chinese, with Uyghurs dancing in their nice national costumes and stuff, and they're so kind of obviously poor attempts, at least for Western eyes, to sell China to the world as a cool place to live. So I'm not going to again have any rose-coloured spectacles about it. There is obviously tension there. Only 60% of the population in Xinjiang are Uyghurs. There are some other minorities, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, but also a large contingent of Han Chinese who've been there a long time. Apparently, at the end of the revolution, the Kuomintang held Xinjiang, but they surrendered peacefully and handed Xinjiang over to the People's Republic of China. And all of those Kuomintang people stayed in Xinjiang, and their descendants are still there. Ken Hammond then has shown the deficit of evidence, as has Max Blumenthal. I mean, Max Blumenthal makes the point that Adrian Zenz never submits his writings to respectable academic publications, and his work is never peer-reviewed. And there's a guy called Bay Area 415 who goes anonymously on the internet wearing a mask, who claims he's a US attorney. He certainly sounds like an American. Who claims that he does in fact in his broadcast go through Adrian Zenz's subnotes and notes and references with a minute tooth comb, and shows that Adrian Zenz will give a reference, but he's very selective about what he picks out of it. It's never comprehensive, and in fact his material is objectively bunk, you know. And the fact that the guy is a complete and absolute crackpot, I suppose, shouldn't tempt us into ad hominem attacks. But I mean, I don't know. Would you trust anybody who thinks in that way? I kind of find it very difficult. I do. I have looked at other material that is pro the Holocaust in Xinjiang story, particularly a certain Rushan Abbas, and I don't find that people like Rushan Abbas are particularly plausible. So, I mean, my conclusion is that the Xinjiang Holocaust genocide story is in pretty much the same league as the weapons of mass destruction story that we were sold to justify absolutely terrible war in Iraq, which killed 500,000 people and made the Middle East an even more dangerous place than it already was. The other thing you get with the propaganda is a resurrection of the very, very old racist trope that was alive in Europe and in the US in the last century and the century before, which is to view China as the yellow peril, as a dangerous other. And when you heard Trump going on about China virus, you know, as Wuhan flu, as just a slander, basically, when he would be talking about COVID-19. What he was trying to do there was to resonate with the memory, I suppose it is by now, of the yellow peril of of a subterranean racist attitude against China. So that's there in the concoction too. So I'm saying all that, but it's very interesting, and that this morning, in fact, there was an announcement which makes you take kind of a fresh view of all of this material that I've just tried to present to you. Now, a few days ago, John Kerry, who is the US government climate envoy, and has famously worked on climate for the US government, particularly at the Paris meetings, which resulted in the Paris Accord, went to Shanghai to speak with very high officials from the Chinese government about climate change and about how the world's two biggest polluters, the world's two biggest emitters of carbon dioxide, could cooperate on tackling climate change in a very positive way. And we've had all this kind of saber rattling and all of this propaganda against China from the US and the West in general. And yet there's this very polite meeting going on because the world is going to go up in flames if nothing's done about carbon dioxide emissions. And today, I think it was this morning even, there was a communique was put out to the world, a press release, whatever you call it, a joint communique from John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, saying that in very plain language, in a very straightforward manner, that the US and China had agreed that they would engage in close cooperation to mitigate climate change. Just like that. So there's the absolute willingness to be rational and cooperative right in the midst of all the sabre rattling and all the propaganda, and it's vicious propaganda. Also in this context, it's interesting that President Xi Jinping did meet recently, last week I think, virtually, with President Macron of France and Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany. So I'm going to conclude by asking the question here: who benefits? Who benefits from this? The way this situation is being presented? And I would say that the oligarchs in the West, the capitalist oligarchs, benefit greatly because they are using China to create an external other who can be blamed and who can be used to arouse fear in home populations. This is the Cold War revisited. This is what they did with the Cold War between the Soviet bloc and the West. It's a tried and tested method of creating fear in populations, a kind of divide and rule, global divide and rule, by creating an external other, a threat, an inhuman threat, a yellow peril in this case. The other benefactors, well, they're not the other benefactors, but they're a branch, you might say, of the oligarchs. The military-industrial complex obviously benefits because they get huge contracts for more and more weapons. And whether a war is fought or not, they still benefit because there's an arms race. So you build a new series of weapons, a new series of surface-to-air missiles, say. And then the Chinese come up with something that renders those weapons more or less useless. A defence is found against them. So you then have to go back to the drawing board and develop an even better weapon. Of course, this thing's escalating now into space wars, cyber wars, of course, which is huge. Maybe battlefield robotics, and certainly I think the cyber is going to be huge. Which is why the Chinese expertise in tech is viewed with such dismay and fear in the West. And why the West isn't so keen for China to become self-sufficient in microchips, for instance. So, yeah, the powers that be in the West do benefit from this Cold War, and particularly the military-industrial complex, which is right at the heart of it. You could say the military-industrial complex is the deep state. And I'm quoting from a CIA whistleblower called Kevin Shipp on this. He described the military-industrial complex as the deep state. And all of the security agents, CIA, NSA, Homeland Security, all of these people as the shadow government. So this existing power structure benefits, and the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few in the West, in Western capitalism, they benefit. And the military-industrial complex, which is coterminous with a large section of the oligarchs, also benefits in as much as it's going to get more and more contracts for weapons, whether there's a war or not. And this is the game that's being played. I mean, there's a few little nuances that come to my attention over recent days. And one is that the military-industrial complex is now being joined, or is absorbing, some big tech companies like Microsoft and Facebook right now, being incorporated into the military-industrial complex. And I think this is partly to do with the emphasis that everybody foresees in military strategy on cyber warfare, on hacking. If you hack your enemy's systems, the military communication systems, or maybe their power grids, or whatever, you're in a very good place vis-a-vis war. And Microsoft, I think, have been asked to supply virtual reality visors for soldiers, so they can heat scan to see if there's an enemy around the corner, and they can get satellite photos and all kinds of stuff in front of them on a visor. This will make those tech companies even richer and perhaps even more dangerous. As far as I can see, this whole situation is rather dangerous. I'm hoping that good sense will prevail, and the John Kerry exercise, I think, has shown us that there is another side possible to all this. And for myself, I think it would just be much better if we had mature and intelligent politicians. They would be engaging with China, talking to Russia, and getting on board with the programme. But of course, they are bearing in mind, I think, our Western capitalist oligarchs, that the Chinese Communist Party, for all of its faults and imperfections, does state as its committed aim its long-term plan, and they are quite good at long-term planning, is that in 2050 China will be completely and fully socialist, kind to nature, zero carbon, and very kind to nature, and that the mass of the population will be quite prosperous and able to live a very good life, all probably about 1.5 billion of them by then. And I suppose it's even more alarming to the Western oligarchs that the Chinese government receives a very high approval rating from its own people. It's somewhere between 80 and 90%. Now, I suppose you're going to say, or somebody like Rushan Abbas would probably like to say that, well, they conduct their own surveys. Nobody's going to tick the box saying they think the government's doing a terrible job in case the secret police come round and get them. But this, what I'm referring to here actually is a study of public opinion in China conducted by Harvard University, which again is right at the heart of the establishment beast in the US. 80 to 90% of Chinese people think that the Chinese government's doing a good job. And 8 million people belong to the Communist Party, are actually members of the Communist Party. And I'll just add here that in Martin Jakes' estimation, civil liberties in China are actually pretty good. Citizens can travel anywhere they like, and they do travel anywhere they like, and there are good educational opportunities, and so forth. So we have to be a little bit careful in our appraisals of what's going on. But as I said, the rational way to proceed in this currently dangerous situation is for the nations of the world to talk, jaw, and that needs to be done. And people conducting analysis of what's going on need to be very, very straight, very clear-eyed, and fearless. I hope that's been useful to you. I don't know whether I've covered everything. I've amassed an enormous amount of material and had to do a lot of thinking about some of these issues. But, well, thanks for listening. If you're a patron, you will have heard a shortened and spontaneous version of this, one of our raw thought offerings that Anna and myself did walking round the hill. And this is an attempt to expand on that. And I did find some new twists and turns in this story. And I expect that I'm going to now, I find it very interesting, I'm going to try and keep up with what's going on. And I'll update you every now and then. Under interesting times. And brackets China, perhaps we'll call this. Anyway, thanks for listening. Look after yourselves. Wash your hands and all that stuff. Lots of love. Make knowledge great again. Over and out.